On the morning of January 7, 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stepped into a crowded briefing room at his headquarters in Belgium, facing rows of British and American correspondents who sat poised with notebooks and sharpened pencils. He wore his unmistakable black beret, the two badges glinting beneath the harsh winter light. The journalists expected the usual recitation of casualty counts, enemy withdrawals, and the steady grind of military progress that typically accompanied Allied briefings. What they received instead was something entirely different, something that would send shockwaves through the Allied command structure, push General Omar Bradley to the brink of resignation within a single day, and strain the bedrock of the Anglo-American alliance so severely that Winston Churchill himself would have to intervene to prevent a political rupture. Within a week, the unity of the Allied High Command would be trembling so violently that some feared it might shatter altogether. What Montgomery said that day could not be undone, and such words, spoken with supreme confidence yet breathtaking insensitivity, nearly tore apart the most important partnership of the Second World War. To understand the magnitude of what unfolded in that room, one must first understand the battle that brought the Allies to that moment. On December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched what he believed would be his final, decisive stroke in the West. 29 German divisions, including some of the last reserves of the Wehrmacht, crashed into thinly manned American lines spread across the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack achieved total surprise. In the first 2 days, entire American regiments were thrown backward or swallowed up in the onrushing German tide. Roads clogged with refugees, shattered units, and desperate rear area personnel fleeing encirclement. By the end of the first week, the Germans had punched a deep 60-mile-long protrusion, soon to be known as the Bulge, into the Allied front. The enemy threatened to seize Antwerp, the critical port through which Allied supplies flowed. For the United States Army, it became the bloodiest battle of the war, costing more than 89,000 casualties across 6 brutal weeks of winter fighting. The opening days were chaos: snowstorms, fog, cut telegraph lines, broken radio nets. Units forced to fight blind and often surrounded. It was the most terrifying crisis the Americans had faced since their landings in Normandy. 4 days after the German attack began, on December 20th, General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, made a decision he knew would be controversial. The German thrust had effectively sliced Bradley's 12th Army Group in half, isolating his northern armies from his headquarters in Luxembourg. Communications were unreliable, sometimes non-existent. Eisenhower concluded that the only practical solution was to place all Allied forces north of the Bulge, most notably the American First Army under General Courtney Hodges and the American Ninth Army under General William Simpson, temporarily under the command of Bernard Montgomery, whose headquarters lay closer to the threatened sector. To Eisenhower, it was a matter of simple operational necessity. To General Omar Nelson Bradley, however, the decision was a personal humiliation. These were his armies, under his leadership since Normandy. To see them handed over to Montgomery, a man Bradley distrusted, resented, and believed to be both condescending and meddlesome, was infuriating. Bradley argued that the communication difficulties were temporary and manageable. He warned Eisenhower that placing American forces under British command would be politically explosive in the United States, where public sentiment was already sensitive about British influence. He insisted that American forces were holding and did not need to be rescued by a British commander. Eisenhower overruled him. The change would be temporary, he insisted. It was about efficiency, not judgment. But Bradley understood the optics. The Americans had been caught off guard, hit hard, and now For the first time in the war, they were being placed under British leadership to clean up the mess. And that is exactly how Montgomery would soon portray it. When Montgomery arrived at Hodges's First Army headquarters on December 20th, he entered, by his own later description, what he considered an atmosphere of disorganization and confusion. He believed American commanders were exhausted, uncertain, and struggling to piece together a coherent defensive strategy. His chief of staff later wrote that they found the command situation in near crisis. Montgomery quickly set about reorganizing lines, pulling back scattered American units, creating a tighter defensive perimeter, and preparing reserves for counterattacks. To his credit, he imposed order. The northern shoulder of the Bulge began to stabilize under his direction. He also moved the British 30th Corps into position as a strategic reserve behind American lines, though they would not be committed to combat until the crisis had already eased. Yet, in truth, the most consequential maneuver of the battle came not from Montgomery, but from General George S. Patton. On December 19, a full day before Montgomery took over in the north, Patton executed one of the most astonishing operational feats of the war. He pivoted 3 divisions of his Third Army 90 degrees to the north, marched them more than 100 miles across snow-covered roads, and launched a counterattack toward the besieged town of Bastogne. By December 26th, Patton's troops had fought their way through German lines and relieved the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. From then on, Patton hammered into the southern flank of the Bulge, while Hodges attacked from the north. By the first days of January, the German advance was unraveling. The Allies were squeezing the salient from both sides, and the Wehrmacht was retreating. With the crisis fading, Montgomery decided the moment had come to address the press. He told his staff he wanted to clarify misunderstandings about the battle, to ensure proper credit was given, and to make sure the British public understood the contribution of their own forces. His staff urged caution. They warned that American sensitivity on the matter was high. They advised letting Eisenhower issue any public statements. Montgomery ignored them. He had a narrative he wanted to present, and so, on January 7, 1945, the fateful press conference began. Montgomery opened by describing the German assault and his assumption of command over the northern sector. But then, he began to speak in a way that startled the American correspondents in the room. "The battle has been most interesting," he declared. "Perhaps one of the most interesting and tricky operations I have ever handled." The phrasing struck them immediately. One of the most interesting battles he had handled? Not one Hodges had handled. Not one American forces had borne through blood and cold. From there, he spoke almost exclusively in the first person. "The first thing I did was to tidy up the battle," he said, describing how he had reorganized the American units, positioned reserves, and prepared counterattacks. He went on to explain that he personally took measures to ensure the Germans could not reach the Meuse River. He portrayed British forces entering the battle as the decisive factor. American reporters scribbled furiously. They knew they were hearing something explosive. But the most damaging moment came when Montgomery declared that British forces were now fighting on both sides of American units, who have had a very hard blow. To many American ears, the implication was unmistakable. The Americans had faltered. The British had stepped in to save them, and Montgomery had been the architect of the rescue. It did not help that when asked about Patton's relief of Bastogne, Montgomery offered only a curt, "Patton has done very well indeed," before returning to his own actions. His tone suggested that Patton's extraordinary maneuver was merely adequate, while his own administrative adjustments were the true turning point of the battle. The British press reacted with unrestrained enthusiasm. London's newspapers ran headlines glorifying Montgomery's leadership. "Monty sorts out the mess," one proclaimed. Another announced triumphantly that the British had rescued the Americans from crisis. British correspondents described Montgomery as the seasoned professional who had swept in to reorganize the inexperienced Americans. Many in Britain, weary from 5 years of war and increasingly anxious about appearing overshadowed by American power, embraced this narrative eagerly. Montgomery once again seemed the hero of North Africa, the Master General. In the United States, the reaction was volcanic. American correspondents blasted Montgomery for arrogance and for diminishing the achievements of American soldiers who had endured the worst of the fighting. Newspapers across the country condemned the press conference. Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper read by soldiers on the front, reported the remarks with scathing commentary. Soldiers who had fought and bled in the forests around Bastogne were furious to read that a British general who entered the battle only after the worst had passed was claiming he had saved them. For Omar Bradley, the press conference was the final insult. For 2 years, he had endured Montgomery's slights, his lectures, his tendency to claim credit for Allied victories, and what Bradley saw as deep-rooted contempt for American leadership. Bradley had swallowed his pride when Eisenhower temporarily gave Montgomery command of his armies, but he would not tolerate Montgomery publicly taking credit for an American victory. That day, Bradley sat at his desk in Luxembourg and wrote out his resignation as commander of the 12th Army Group. He was ready to walk away. More than that, several senior American generals were prepared to resign alongside him. The Allied command was on the brink of disintegration. When Eisenhower learned of this, he understood at once the gravity of the crisis. If Bradley resigned, the political consequences in Washington would be immense. Congress would demand hearings. The American public, already sensitive to any suggestion of British superiority, would react with outrage. Eisenhower telephoned Bradley and begged for 48 hours to repair the damage. Bradley reluctantly agreed to delay submitting his resignation. Eisenhower then called Montgomery. The conversation was difficult. Eisenhower explained bluntly that Montgomery's remarks had ignited a firestorm among American commanders and soldiers alike. Montgomery seemed genuinely surprised. He insisted he had praised American troops. He claimed he had described a fine Allied picture. He could not understand why there was anger. Eisenhower tried to explain the tone, the emphasis on "I did this," the suggestion that American lines had to be reorganized by a British general, the minimizing of Patton's contribution. Montgomery appeared to grasp only part of the problem. He agreed to issue a clarification, though he made it clear he felt the Americans were overreacting. Winston Churchill, by contrast, understood immediately how dangerous the situation was. The British Prime Minister knew how much Britain depended on American support. He knew that if Montgomery's remarks were allowed to stand unchallenged, they could inflict lasting political damage. Churchill prepared a speech for the House of Commons, delivered on January 18, 1945, crafted with extraordinary care. He praised American forces lavishly, emphasizing that the Battle of the Bulge had been primarily an American struggle. He stated plainly that American troops had borne the overwhelming share of casualties. He honored their bravery, their suffering, their sacrifice. He acknowledged Montgomery's role, but made it clear it had been supportive, not decisive. His message was unmistakable. Britain understood and respected American leadership. 3 days later, on January 21st, Montgomery released his own statement. It was less an apology than an attempt to explain himself. He insisted that he admired American soldiers and commanders. Yet even in this attempt to calm tensions, Montgomery could not resist inserting phrases that implied equivalence with Eisenhower, describing himself as devoted to Ike, as though two great leaders stood side by side. American officers read the statement and concluded that Montgomery still did not understand what he had done. At last, with Churchill's speech having softened public and political anger, Eisenhower returned to Bradley and asked him to withdraw his resignation for the sake of Allied unity. Bradley agreed, but he demanded assurances. Montgomery was never again to be given command over American forces except in absolute emergency. Eisenhower promised. He also promised that he, and not Montgomery, would personally direct the final Allied push into Germany. The consequences of that promise would shape the closing months of the war. The aftermath of the press conference left wounds that never fully healed. Many American commanders who had previously tolerated Montgomery now despised him openly. Bradley refused to meet with him unless Eisenhower was present. Patton made Montgomery the subject of derisive jokes, some of which spread throughout the American ranks. British and American leaders continued to cooperate, but the easy camaraderie of earlier campaigns was replaced with cautious formality. Every public statement was weighed for political implications. Montgomery himself never understood why his press conference had caused such outrage. In his post-war memoirs, he described the Battle of the Bulge in a manner that once again suggested his role had been decisive. He sincerely believed he had rescued the Americans from disaster. He dismissed the reaction to his words as a mixture of American oversensitivity and political scheming. History has judged differently. Modern historians agree that while Montgomery's reorganization of the northern sector was competent, it was not decisive. The battle was won primarily through the stubborn defense of American infantry in the first days, the heroic stand of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, the immense contribution of Allied air power once the skies cleared, and Patton's daring maneuver. British troops fought with courage when they entered the battle, but by then, the crisis had already passed. Montgomery's portrayal of British forces as the saviors of the Americans simply does not align with the facts. Yet, the importance of the press conference extends beyond questions of military credit. It revealed a deeper tension within the alliance. British leaders, with years of experience and traditions of professional soldiering, often viewed the rapidly expanded American forces as brave but inexperienced. Americans, providing the bulk of the men, equipment, and logistical might needed to defeat Germany, increasingly resented any suggestion that they were junior partners. Montgomery's words seem to confirm the worst American fears of British condescension. Eisenhower, more than any other Allied commander, understood the fragile balance. His role required balancing national pride, managing strong-willed generals, and maintaining unity among nations with different cultures, goals, and insecurities. When Montgomery's words threatened that unity, Eisenhower acted swiftly and decisively, preventing the rift from widening into a political disaster. But his promise to limit Montgomery's authority also constrained strategic options. The broad front offensive that the Allies pursued in 1945, criticized by some as slow and inefficient, was shaped in part by the political reality created by Montgomery's own missteps. Eisenhower could not afford to appear to favor a British general whose recent actions had enraged American commanders. There is a bitter irony to the episode. Montgomery intended to highlight British contributions, to bolster morale at home, and to secure his own reputation as a master general. Instead, he ensured that British influence in Allied strategy waned. His attempt to elevate himself caused American officers to dismiss him as arrogant, tone-deaf, and politically clumsy. British efforts in the Bulge were, from that point onward, more often downplayed than celebrated, not because of their lack of bravery, but because of Montgomery's insistence on framing events to his own advantage. And so it was that a single press conference, lasting less than an hour, nearly cracked the Allied command wide open at the moment the final victory over Nazi Germany was in sight. Montgomery's inability to understand how his words would sound to an ally that had just endured its most devastating battle almost cost the Allies the unity required to finish the war. It showed that in war, just as in diplomacy, tone matters as much as substance, and pride can be as dangerous as bullets. A great leader must not only command armies, but understand people, their pride, their sacrifices, their sense of honor. On that winter day in Belgium, Bernard Montgomery failed to understand this. And for that brief but perilous moment, the greatest military alliance in history trembled.